Today I want to take a look at ways you could manually correct text on a typewriter. Now, I'd recently done a video about typewriters like these that can use a built-in self-correcting method to correct mistakes. A typewriter like this uses a 2-inch universal spool that can have a white correcting tape right alongside the black ink. But what if you have a typewriter that isn't like that? There were actually solutions available for you that would work out pretty well. So let's go ahead and start out by taking a look at one of my typewriters that does not have any correcting features built in, an IBM Selectric I. This typewriter is not in amazing shape. It's obviously missing some keys and it has some problem with the automatic functions, but I'll be able to work around those for this video. Eventually I'm going to do a video series on repairing all of my IBM typewriters, so I will be doing that at some point and getting this thing fully functional. The white marks all over this typewriter are clear evidence of a particular type of correcting fluid. Whiteout correcting fluid. This is a fairly common form of correction that isn't really linked to typewriters specifically, but it is very usable, and it's probably what most people think of as the only method of correcting on typewriters. If you've never used whiteout fluid before, let me just quickly show you what it was originally meant for. If you're handwriting something with a pen and make a mistake, you use the brush attached to the lid of the whiteout fluid and paint over the mistake. Once it's later dried, you go ahead and rewrite over it. But there's nothing stopping you from using it on a typewriter as well. It was fairly common, and is why my typewriter has white marks all over it. The previous owner who was using this didn't give the whiteout fluid ample time to dry, a fact that IBM actually made fun of in one of their later Selectric commercials. Even though this method was so common, it's far from ideal. The off-color white marks look far from professional, and if you shine light through the paper, you can still see the mistakes underneath. There was another type of correcting fluid though. This is ink Eradicator. Like the whiteout fluid, ink Eradicator predates typewriters and was made for fountain pens. It could dissolve and lighten the ink, and once dry, allow you to retype over the area. This product is actually still made and you can get some new, but we're going to try out my original old version here. I haven't opened this bottle yet at all, so I'm afraid of what horrible smells this is going to make, and I'm not even sure if it's going to work, but let's find out. Huh. I have no idea how you use this. I feel like there must be two parts to this. Apply and blot. Okay. So far, there's actually no smell. I don't have high hopes here, but I'll try letting it dry. Okay, so it did not work on the area I applied it. And for fun, I tried it on some ballpoint pen ink, even though it explicitly says not to. And I tried putting some over here and getting a bit more aggressive with blotting it. But that just removed the top layer of paper, so yeah, the ink is gone. But more interestingly, you see this white powder? So this came out of the cap when I unscrewed it. I think that's the active ingredient because I scraped some of that up and put it on here and then mixed the fluid in, and it actually started to work. So I'm pretty sure this stuff is real and it will eliminate the ink. It just has separated over all the years, probably 50 years. From what I could find, this might be a 70s bottle of this stuff. So yeah, it does work as long as you have the active ingredient mixed into the fluid, not having had it crystallize and leak out. Now I have one more thing I want to show with the IBM Selectric here before we move on to the final typewriter, and that is Erasable Bond typing paper. Erasable Bond typing paper is going to be one of the better looking results when you have to make corrections on your typed page. It is regular paper, but it has a particular coating on it so the ink doesn't permeate it as much, and it's easier to get off with just a standard pencil eraser. The ribbon on here is not doing so great, but let's see how well this erases. That's not amazing. It works, but it's still very, very visible. And there's a real big downside to this, but we'll talk about that more a little bit later. I'm curious if this works at all with a pen. Not really any better than the typewriter ink. Like the ink Eradicator, this paper may be too old to work. It has visibly discolored around the edges, so the chemical process that makes the ink not permeate as much might have worn out over time. Now, in theory, if this paper had worked out perfectly fine, then this would look better than whiteout because it would be less obvious that you've made corrections. But in practice, there are some problems with this paper. The ink obviously isn't coming off, which may have been a problem then. I can't be totally sure about that. But I do know that this paper would have always had problems with smearing text because the ink doesn't permeate as well. And at least this paper is cheapened by the fact that they've put a watermark right in the middle of the page, so anyone you send this paper to is going to know you used Erasable Bond paper, and it's going to seem a bit unprofessional. Yeah, I really think this hasn't aged well. There's no way this paper should be this transparent. If anyone used this paper when it was closer to new, I'd love to hear about your experience with it in the comments. Now, this next method I'm going to demonstrate for correction is actually a little bit newer than these methods for correcting, but I'm going to need a typewriter that has swinging hammers to really show it off. So we're going to switch to my IBM Model B Executive from 1954 for this. And this next one is correction tabs. These correction tabs, made by Correctype, are very simple actually. In this case are just a bunch of thin plastic sheets that have white ink on one side of them. And this is the IBM Model B Executive we will be using. And as I mentioned, it's going to be a lot easier to use because of its swinging hammers. To use the correcting tape, you need to align it over the platen where the hammer will strike so it can press the white ink on. Now on some typewriters, these are going to be kind of annoying to use. The typewriters are designed to lift the ribbon up to the point where the hammers hit so that the ink is there. And you will need to slide the correction tab underneath the ribbon so the white ink is what gets placed. However, there are typewriters like this one that can use the correction tabs without having the ribbon go over it. The IBM Model B Executive was available with two configurations, and mine was given the one that means it has the color switch. While I'm typing, if I hit the color switch, the ribbon is no longer brought up to where the hammers strike, making it much easier for me to use the correcting tab. Alright, it's time for me to actually show fixing mistake with the correction tabs. It's just a little more complicated on the IBM Executive, and let me use the manual here to explain what I mean. This is a section that just covers how to handle erasures. Now, on most typewriters, this isn't an issue. This is only because this is an Executive. And what's special about the Executive is that it has proportional letter spacing. The letters are always the same width on a normal typewriter, but on the Executive, they change depending on how wide the character actually is. Let me give you a demonstration of what I mean here. Now, you can clearly see that the three M's are much wider than the three I's. And this can make your life when correcting errors a bit difficult. The width of a letter is measured in units on the Executive typewriter. The smallest letter space is 2 units. The largest is 5. The table on 21 tells you just how many units each letter is. Yeah, if you're erasing on an Executive typewriter, you're going to be having this sheet constantly open next to you so you can refer to the character widths. Although you could possibly memorize it, it's not too many, but still there's the chance for error. As a result of needing that level of fine control for erasing, the backspace key is the only key that can move 1 unit on the typewriter. Alright, so let's try this out. Because I know M is 5 unit widths, I'm going to accidentally replace the N in "this is a typing test" with an M and erase it. That's not bad. That worked out really well. Unfortunately, I still have to go back 5 spaces after that, though, if I want to type the correct character. I didn't mean to make the other mistakes, but hey, that worked out for testing. These are pretty good. I like these more than I thought I would. Next is a much more rudimentary version of correction, and that is an eraser. Yes, it was possible to use an eraser in a typewriter, though this is a particular kind of eraser. This is a very early eraser and has a much harder rubber than your typical pencil eraser now. A pencil eraser like you would find now is definitely not going to be able to remove typewriter ink from a page. This one, though, is a bit different. Alright, so let's go ahead and try the eraser. It's going to have any of the alignment problems that something like the correcting tabs are going to have, but that's a problem unique to the proportional letter spacing typewriter here. So, alright, let's lift up the paper bale, and we're going to roll back the word we want to erase a little bit farther on the platen so we can press down a bit. And here we go. I haven't actually tried this eraser yet, so I don't know how well this is going to work. And, well, we're getting something. It's a bit old. I think I should maybe go sand it down to get the crusty outer layer off. Okay, I gave it a good sanding, so it's got fresh rubber exposed all around now. So let's see how this behaves now. Oop. And there lies the problem with these erasers. Okay, now I'll answer the question. What's the deal with the brush? Well, as you end up erasing a mistake, you're going to be generating little bits of paper and eraser as you rub on here. And that can fall down into the typewriter. So the brush is for you to brush it all away from the typewriter. Matter of fact, if we go back and look at the Erasable Bond paper when I was using the eraser on that, you can see there are some little particles falling down in my Selectric I. So I don't ever want to use that kind of correcting again. I think I am starting to slowly make it a bit better, so I erased a word there and it looks all right. Let me try it one more time here. Yeah, there we go. Successful erase. Now, it's a little difficult to see, so let me grab a macro lens, but there's a big downside to using this kind of eraser. The entire way this eraser works is by heavily distressing the paper to the point where you remove the top layers of fibers where the ink actually is. So all you're trying to do is get the paper to be as thin as possible. Let me go ahead and try and erase this up close so you can see how this process happens. Notice how nice and smooth the paper is right now. And here it's starting to degrade. And that's it. That's how this eraser works. I wouldn't be surprised if time has taken its toll on this eraser and made it far from a prime candidate for demonstrating this, but from what I've been able to read, this is the proper experience for one of these. This is how it is meant to be used. Next, I want to take a little bit of a detour and talk about making copies with a typewriter, because it was in fact possible to make copies using a typewriter. Matter of fact, an interesting nomenclature stems from that. This is carbon paper. You might know it from the name carbon copy. Carbon paper is the origin of the term carbon copy for including someone else on an email. Fun fact, the term blind carbon copy is a little bit more ambiguous in its history. Now, these carbon sheets are going to be very, very messy, but these are just thin sheets of paper that have carbon on one side. Now, I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate this by making 3 copies of one document. I'm going to build up my carbon copy stack one at a time. So I'm going to have one sheet, then I'm going to put a sheet of carbon paper face down on it, the next sheet, another sheet of carbon paper, and then my final top sheet. And now I'm ready to make carbon copies. Well, almost ready. The next thing I need to do is select my copy through. This lever controls how much space there is between the platen and the hammers and in different areas. I need to set this to 3 since I'm going to be making 3 copies. This is not a ubiquitous feature on typewriters, and if I remember correctly, was omitted from the Selectric III. So this is something you would actually need to pay attention to if you're trying to select a typewriter for making carbon copies. Okay, now that I'm really ready, I'm going to flip my papers so the carbon is facing towards me, give them one final alignment, and put them in the typewriter. I'm now ready to make carbon copies. All right, let's go ahead and try this out. All right, so the ribbon failed on the T on this, and the ribbon rise part has some real problems. But let's see how that worked for the carbon paper, because that should have gone through. So lift up the paper bale, and let's see how it looks. So here is our first sheet. That's interesting. So not quite perfect. And the next one won't be any better. But that's pretty consistent between the two. So let's go ahead and try this some more. That's a little better. There's this thing, it could probably use a complete teardown and re-oil, but yeah, that's not bad. I'm pretty happy with that. It's a bit soft, but that's okay. But what would you do if you made a mistake while using the carbon paper? Well, let's take a look at the different correcting options we have here and see how each one would be affected by that. If you tried to use the whiteout correction fluid, you would have to apply this to every single page you have interleaved in there. Now, on top of that being pretty impractical, you would have a thick layer of whiteout fluid in the way that you then have to try and type through. Now, that isn't going to work with the hammer pressure being pushed through there to make the copies. So you would only be able to type again on the top sheet, meaning you'd have to take each one out afterwards and retype that section. Never mind the fact that you'd have to wait for each individual page to dry before you folded it over, because it would then stick to the next page. What about ink eradicator? Well, ink eradicator works by dissolving the ink. Carbon is not an ink, so this just isn't going to work. All it would do is probably smear the carbon around. Which brings us to Erasable Bond typing paper. Carbon's probably not going to stick to this well, so you're again going to end up with a smeary image. Not ideal. Correctotype tabs. These are going to be the most impractical to use, because you have to type onto each sheet. You would have to remove every single sheet and realign it to the lettering where you need it to be able to apply the white ink to the page. That's not happening. And finally, the eraser. Now, this could almost work. There's just one problem. If you try and erase on the platen of the typewriter, you're going to push the carbon pages all together and you're going to end up with marks on every page but the top one. But there is a solution. This is an eraser shield. The eraser shield is a very, very simple tool. It's just a flat stamped piece of metal with a little bit of a curve to it. The way it's meant to be used is to slide it underneath the pages to act as a backstop while you're using the eraser. This will evenly spread the pressure of the eraser to the carbon sheets, meaning there will be no marks that make it through. Now, before we try the eraser shield and the eraser to erase some mistakes off of here, let's see what happens when we use just the eraser first. So I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to mark up the paper real good. Just go ahead and get some erasing in there. And if we leaf through the carbon sheets, sure enough, we get a big black smudge on there, and that's definitely not what we want. So let's go ahead and make a mistake on the next line. Okay, so let's begin the process of erasing all 3 copies using the eraser shield as a backing material. All right, so starting with the top page, I'm going to separate the first sheet in the carbon pad, slide the eraser shield in there, and then bring it back slightly, and here we go. Oh, the eraser really doesn't like working on the metal. Now, you'll have to forgive it being yellowed by the eraser. Just pretend this is not yellowing it and is much newer. But that worked. So let's look at the sheet below and see if we transferred anything. We did not. No pressure at all. The mistake is still there, untouched. Which means it's time for the next sheet. One more to go, and this one is on the platen directly, so I don't need to use the eraser shield, although I actually kind of found that better to use than just the platen. And there we go. All 3 sheets worth of mistakes erased, which means I can very carefully go back and try and retype this now and see if I can get it realigned correctly. Now, back to the manual for the Executive. The erasing note is telling you to attempt to line up the characters where you want to type with the left side of the indicator. So I'm just going to try that with the T and see if I can get it to realign correctly. And that worked. Of course, it then failed to type correctly. Oh, well, that's not doing me favors. I'll show you that in a moment. It doesn't look right on here, but I suspect on the carbon sheets. Well, the A just didn't hit well at all, but you get the idea. Well, that's part of my problem. That's not how that's supposed to work. I need to go through and unclog the ribbon from there and get that re-spooled back on here now. Oh, there we go, all better. The joys of typewriter ownership. Now, continuing on with the idea of copying and mistake correcting, I want to talk about how larger batches of copies from a typewriter could be made and how corrections fit in. An extremely affordable method of copying was introduced in 1923 called a ditto machine. Here in North America, at least. It's known as a spirit duplicator elsewhere. It worked similarly to carbon copies by transferring a wax material from a full sheet of wax to the one you are typing on. Mistakes could be corrected by carefully scraping the wax off of the final stencil. But retyping over the same area wouldn't be as clear because there would be less wax, but at least you would be able to remove the mistake. Once completed, the typed paper is wrapped around a drum and it is rolled over blank sheets. The wax transfers from the typed sheet and is the only source of ink. It depletes rather quickly, yielding only a couple dozen copies. A mimeograph could be used if more copies were needed. Mimeographs use stencils to apply ink from a rotating drum to produce an image. Wax stencils can be made with a typewriter and work by transferring wax from a mesh to a plastic sheet when the typewriter strikes it. The mesh is the stencil used. If a mistake is made, it can be corrected by using a special correcting fluid that fills in the removed area on the stencil.
When an error is made, roll up a few spaces. Pull back the plastic covering and brush a light coating of correction fluid over the error. Let it dry a few seconds. Replace the covering and tap the correct key lightly. You may want to tap it again to match the other characters. A lighter character looks less conspicuous than a heavy one.
Both the Ditto machine and mimeograph were reasonably affordable machines that let a school or business create their own professional batch copies easily. And even those could be corrected to allow for quick production. Well, that's pretty much every method of correcting for a typewriter that there is. Well, except that there are two more. Oh, oops. No. And that would have been fine for most people, at least in a personal setting. In a professional setting, if you were typing out a complicated document that has margins and alignments, or maybe a chart with important numbers in it, and you made a small little mistake, it would have been time-consuming to tear out the page and retype the whole thing. So, in a professional setting, it would have made a lot of sense to be able to make a small correction to a page, rather than have to waste the time retyping everything. But that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. I spent quite a bit of time trying to find every single method of correcting on a typewriter that was available, and I think I got them all. If you know of one that I missed, I would love to know about it in the comments, because I find this stuff fascinating. Matter of fact, I've had many of these for a long time, like the typing paper, and I've just been trying to figure out how I can incorporate them into a video. Finally, one big video on every single one of them seemed to make the most sense. So I have really enjoyed making this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you want to support the channel, I am on Patreon, but for now, that's it. I'll see you next time.